Good evening, everyone. My name is Rafael Santana. I'm the Dean of the School of Communication at Universidad Panamericana in Guadalajara. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Clemenson, who is going to talk to us about how politicians dodge questions and how they get caught, strategies for political campaigns, journalists, and voters. This session will be recorded and live streamed on YouTube at Universidad Panamericana Campus Guadalajara channel. This session will be in English, but you can click on the interpretation meeting control to choose to hear the Spanish audio from the interpreter. We'll have a 45-minute session, and then we will start a question and answer section moderated by Dr. Dixie Santana, researcher professor of the School of Communications. And if you have any questions, you will be able to write it on the chat, either in English or in Spanish. Let me introduce you to Dr. David Clemenson, who we are very honored to have with us today. Dr. Clemenson is an assistant professor in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations, Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at University of Georgia. He holds a PhD in communication from the Ohio State University, a master's degree in communication studies from University of Miami, and a bachelor's degree in political science in James Madison University. Dr. Clemenson runs experiments testing how politicians and business spokespersons dodge reporters' questions and whether audiences notice. His latest studies assess whether the public can detect when a company spokesperson is dodging a question amidst a company crisis and the different ways a public figure might deceive audiences. Dr. Clemenson worked in journalism, politics, and public relations for about a decade. He was a journalist for newspapers and magazines, primarily covering politics and government. He ran a successful political campaigns for Democrats and Republicans in several states along the United States East Coast. He also served as a communication director for public relations, marketing, and advertising firms. A professional opposition researcher for politicians and director of communication and press secretary for attorney generals. So, Dr. Clemenson, welcome. It's great to have you with us, and we are very sure we're going to enjoy your conference today. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let me pull up my slides right now. All right. My thanks to you, Director Santana. Thank you for your leadership of the School of Communications and for all that you do for everyone. And thank you to Professor Josefina and Professor Nilsa for all of your good work on this event. And Jaime for running things, and a special thank you to our fearless translator, Aaron, for making me sound good in multiple languages. All right, so my talk today, as you see, is how politicians dodge questions and how they get caught. And so the first part of our talk will be me discussing this phenomenon and how it transpires and how it works and how we get swept up into falling prey to deception. And then the last part of my talk will be those strategies as they apply for political campaigns and really diabolical politicians, as well as strategies for journalists and voters. A little bit about myself, as Director Santana pointed out, I've worked on both sides of media relations. I've been the one who asked questions of politicians and the one who was asked questions by journalists. I worked as a journalist myself for newspapers and magazines covering politics and government and interviewing politicians. And then I switched over to the public relations side, where I worked for politicians as a director of communications and a press secretary, representing politicians and giving interviews to the media. So here I am in academia, running experiments and running studies where I'm exploring the kinds of things I did previous to academia. All right, so what we're talking about today is deception in politics by politicians in question and answer events. such as press conferences, news, and debates. There's a lot of different ways that deception takes place in politics, and we're all under the impression that politicians are some of the most deceptive people on the planet. And there are all kinds of different ways that they are deceptive, but specifically, we're just focusing on press conferences, news interviews, debates, those kinds of question and answer events. So generally speaking, there are 4 basic categories of deception, according to theories of deception. The first is lies, when we get lied to by politicians. The second is omitting information, when they don't tell us all the details of something. Now, those first 2, lies and omitting information, are things that are hard for them to deny. They typically get caught when they engage in those. And it's very difficult for us as observers of political events to be able to spot them for ourselves. We don't necessarily know, for example, if a politician is lying about how he voted on a particular piece of legislation in Congress or about his biography. However, those second set of forms of deception, evasion and being vague or ambiguous, are forms of deception that we as observers of political interactions can potentially, hopefully, spot live in our viewing of an interaction and be able to discern for ourselves. But still, a politician has more deniability with those also, because it's kind of in the eye of the beholder as to whether their form of evasion was really deceptive and offensive or not. So we're going to move along looking at deceptive evasion. Now, there are other forms of evasion, obviously, which aren't deceptive, such as saying no comment. I'm not going to talk about that. That's a form of evasion, but you're telling the truth. You're not trying to deceive. And deception is generally defined as intentionally misleading someone. All right, so given that intro there, I'm going to be asking and answering 9 big questions along the way. The first is, how often do politicians actually dodge questions? How do they dodge questions, and why do they dodge questions? There's this big perception that politicians are really evasive. They're never giving a straight answer to a straight question. They're very deceptive. And I started out my programmatic line of research by looking at presidential press conferences and presidential debates to examine the extent to which they actually do dodge. So one study, I looked at the kinds of topics, the kinds of issues that presidents were talking about in their State of the Union address, which is their unfiltered speech that they give annually, where they talk about whatever they want to talk about. So that's a good starting place for seeing what kinds of issues they actually want to talk about. And we coded 15 years of presidential news conferences that followed those State of the Union addresses as an index of the president's expressed agenda. And results showed that presidents answered most questions without attempting to dodge the general topic. So they don't always dodge questions. They aren't always evasive. They usually are answering questions. However, meaningful proportions of presidents' responses are overt refusals to answer the question or going off into talking about other topics. And I categorized their answers as being either overt refusals to answer or same topic responses or different topic responses. We see most of the time they are on topic, but about 10% of their answers are overt refusals to answer. And a lot of the time they're going off into other topics. And it doesn't matter whether the subject matter is something that was part of their expressed agenda from their State of the Union address or not, the extent to which they're going off topic or not. And we see that while most of the time they're giving same topic answers. When they do evade questions, the primary way they do it is by giving a same topic response, or at least sounding like they're talking about the topic of the question, but then going off and introducing other kinds of topics to change the subject, to employ these diversionary maneuvers. So that's how politicians tend to dodge questions, is by introducing other completely irrelevant topics. And there's this interesting quotation back when President Obama was doing debates, campaign debates, and his advisor, David Axelrod, told him about presidential debates. He told Obama, quote, "Half the time the moderator is just using the question to try to trip you up. Your job is to avoid the trap they've set. Take whatever question they give you, give them a quick line to make it seem like you answered it, and then talk about what you want to talk about." Now, that quotation is in Obama's recently published presidential memoirs. And we see right there a few things. One, presidential debates are a primary place where they're dodging questions. And two, they are initially talking about the same topic, but then going completely off topic. So that brings us to our second question. Why do we think politicians are so deceptive? And in this study, I looked at just presidential debates, where unlike in Mexico, where you have 3 or 4 major parties, maybe more, debating, in the US, it's generally just 2 parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. And from examining presidential debate transcripts, we see a few really important things. Well, first of all, it's crucial to examine presidential debates because they're the most watched events in all of politics. And so people's impressions of the evasiveness of politicians is largely driven by presidential debates. So a few takeaways from that study. One, they frequently accuse each other of evasion. So we've got the Democrats and the Republicans and their voters, their base, are watching these debates, and they're accusing each other of being deceptive. And ironically, we believe them when they tell us that the other one can't be believed. Pretty interesting takeaway there. Furthermore, analyzing the debate transcripts, we see that their allegations of each other are usually false. That is, usually when one accuses the other of not answering a question, if you look at what the person had said in response to the question, they actually did answer it more often than not. A third takeaway from these debates is the time constraints. They're asked to, give their answer for solving world hunger or world peace, and they've got 30 seconds to answer it. So naturally, they're going to appear to not have fully answered a question if they've got these ridiculous time constraints. And fourth, most of the questions they're asked, kind of like as David Axelrod said to Obama, these are complex no-win questions. They're just no-win for you, a rhetorical minefield, because they're very divisive. So brings us to our third question. What are the partisan effects of politicians dodging questions? Because we know that partisan bias plays a big role in people's perceptions of the evasiveness of politicians. So I ran a study where I filmed a news interview with a real journalist interviewing a politician, and I manipulated the interview such that for half the participants, the politician was a Republican, and for half, the politician was a Democrat, the 2 major parties in the US. Just simply put an R or a D next to the politician's name on the screen. And I manipulated whether the politician actually dodged a question from the reporter or answered a question from the reporter. And the experimental findings were that a voter's own party politician was considered more trustworthy regardless of whether the politician was dodging or answering the question. So whether the politician was trustworthy or untrustworthy was largely driven by that letter, that R or D next to the name of the politician on the screen, regardless of whether the politician was dodging or answering questions. Another takeaway from that study was that more dodging was detected from opposing party politicians. So I asked the participants, which were all voters in the US, how much dodging did you detect from the politician? And if the politician had the opposing party label, people detected more dodging than if it was their same in-group politician, regardless of whether the politician had actually been dodging or not. But truth bias still prevailed more than partisan bias or deception bias. Now, what I mean by this is, even though most people thought he was more trustworthy or less trustworthy, depending on the party affiliation and the dodge detection, still overall, people were more truth biased, meaning they didn't perceive any dodging, and thus, if in fact he wasn't dodging, they were correct. But if he was dodging, they were incorrect. And there was a slight advantage over that truth bias than partisan bias or deception bias. You'd think people would have more of a deception bias in assuming the politician would be deceptive. But no, they had more of a truth bias, meaning that we get into the psychology of this, where people are defaulting to the truth, where they tend to believe what they are being told and not question it unless they're told otherwise by someone else. And we'll get more into that a little bit later. Bringing us to the fourth question. All right, so we know about the role of truth bias. We know about the role of partisan bias. What factors also make voters susceptible to deception? And in this line of studies, I expose people to the same experimental manipulation of watching a political interview and then responding to it. And I looked at other factors that could be driving people's perceptions to the evasiveness of politicians. And I looked at the two different kinds of identification. One being identification with a politician, which is different from party identification. So identification with a politician relates to the process of an audience member sharing the goals and perspective of a media character. This is a phenomenon in mass communication of identification. For example, when a person watches a TV show and identifies with the experience of a character, the viewer connects with the other's feelings and emotions. And in this study, I was examining how politicians can speak in such a way that voters believe that they personally share the politician's sentiments and thus feel as though they identify with the politician. And the extension here, extending the phenomenon of identification to deceptiveness in politics, is that a deceptive politician may seem honest and mislead people into with him. Because when an audience member identifies with a media character, the audience member gets swept up in the reality presented by the politician and suspends disbelief. And sure enough, in the study, the results showed that when viewers identify with a politician, they consider the politician less deceptive. And they even fail to notice deception because of the process of absorption and involvement in taking the politician's perspective. So conversely, those who do not identify with a politician are more likely to detect a dodge and to see the politician's answer as being irrelevant. And the overall effect here was that party identification, meaning that you're a Republican or a Democrat, and then you see that the politician is either a Democrat or Republican, as you have party identification, you're more inclined to manifest identification, the phenomenon from mass communication of identifying with the politician. And even when the politician is dodging questions, you actually think the answers were relevant. So people are manipulated by party identification and getting swept up in identifying with the politician. So even beyond party affiliation, we see the power of identification, which has ramifications for independent voters who aren't even partisan voters, as we'll touch on a little bit later. Bringing us to question number 5, because some of you might be wondering, okay, what about the implications for the internet? When we see news interviews, we're watching a news interview of a politician, and it's online, and there are web comments, a comment section below the clip of the news interview. So I ran a study where I showed the same interview online, but underneath the interview, I created comments. So for example, and the participants were randomly assigned to either see comments that were blaming the politician or blaming the journalist, or they were a control condition where they were exposed to no comments at all. So for example, in the condition where the politician was being blamed for being evasive, the comments said things like, a whole lot of questions were dodged by that congressional candidate. Politicians like him never answer questions. Yup, he was really evasive. And then for those who were exposed to the other type of comment section, those comments said a whole lot of the reporters' questions were worded tricky for that congressional candidate. Political interviews never let politicians answer questions. Yep, the TV interview style might have made the politician look evasive when he wasn't. So we see that the comments are either accusatory toward the journalist or accusatory toward the politician to look at the attributions of blame for perceptions of evasion. And as you might expect, the results showed that those comment sections are really, really powerful, that people are really influenced by the sentiments of anonymous strangers on the internet. For example, I asked all the participants in the study how evasive they thought the politician was. And sure enough, if they were exposed to comments that were accusing the politician of being evasive, they thought he was being very evasive. If the comments were kind of defending the politician against the media, then they didn't think he was as evasive. And then the control group, in which participants were not exposed to any comments, was right in the middle. And then I looked at attitudes, asked everyone their attitudes toward the journalist and their attitudes toward the politician. And we noticed 2 things here for those of you interested in journalism, that the attitudes toward the journalist really didn't change. There was not a significant difference among attitudes toward the journalist, no matter which condition the participants were in. But attitudes toward the politician did change. We see that comments were more influential in affecting attitudes toward the politician. And I asked all the participants in the experiment how credible they thought the politician and the journalist were. And we see that journalists are pretty impervious to criticism from comment sections. Looking at the bars on the far right there, we see there wasn't a difference in the credibility of the politician and the credibility of the journalist, even when the comments were accusatory toward the journalist. And then there was a behavioral component to the study where I asked all the participants, all right, if you could type your own comments underneath this web clip, what would you type? And we saw that people behaved in such a way that they would criticize the politician or praise the journalist if the comments they were exposed to were doing that. Conversely, they would criticize the journalist or praise the politician if the comments were telling them. But in the control group, where they were exposed to no comments at all, we see extremely high criticism of the politician or praising the journalist. All right, so that's the experiments I ran looking at the effects of web comment sections in influencing people's perceptions of evasiveness in politics. Getting question 6. Now, this is another study I'm running a lot. This is, what effect does it have when a journalist accuses a politician of dodging? All right, so we just saw the effects of web comment sections below a news interview in which anonymous strangers are either defending or accusing the politician or the journalist of playing into this dynamic of evasion. But sometimes journalists themselves would just outright accuse a politician of dodging a question. And so I created a news interview in which a real politician or a real journalist accused a politician of dodging a question. In the interview, the politician gave an answer to a question, and then half the participants saw the journalist accuse the politician of dodging the question, saying, with all due respect, Congressman, you didn't answer the question, you're dodging the question. And then the other half of the participants saw the exact same interview, but without the journalist accusing the politician of dodging the question. Also, an interesting element of this study was that the politician didn't actually dodge the question. The journalist was being disingenuous. It was a bogus allegation of evasion. The politician honestly answered the question, and then the journalist falsely accused them of dodging. And so I looked at a few outcome variables here, looking at the effects of the allegation of evasion causing people to perceive evasiveness. And sure enough, there were significantly more perceptions of evasion when the journalist said so. When the journalist accused the politician of being evasive, they thought he was evasive. Conversely, they thought he was more straightforward and disclosive when he wasn't accused of dodging the question. And same with attitudes toward the politician. Their attitudes aligned with whether the journalist said he was evasive or not. And then an overall kind of effect that I looked at was that the journalist's allegation of evasion caused people to be suspicious of the politician, and then their elevated level of suspicion made people perceive more dodging from the politician. And then ultimately, the politician's trustworthiness was affected by whether or not the journalist had accused the politician of being evasive, with rumination being this overarching kind of moderating effect over it all. Now, rumination is where you fixate over something, you kind of obsess over something, you keep thinking, well, I wanted answers to that question. Why didn't the politician answer the question? So we see the power of a journalist to accuse a politician of being evasive, and voters taking the journalist's word for it, even when the politician actually wasn't evasive. Which then brings us to our next question. All right. When a journalist accuses a politician of dodging and the politician refutes the allegation, how do voters know whom to believe? We saw in the last study that a journalist's allegation against a politician is very strong. Voters take the journalist's word for it. So the takeaway from that would be, all right, if you're a politician, you've got to defend yourself. You can't assume that voters will pay attention to the interview and be able to discern for themselves whether you really dodged the question or not. No, they're gonna, voters are going to believe the journalist. And so the takeaway for politicians would be, all right, you've got to refute the allegation. You've got to say, I did answer your question, right? You've got to defend yourself. So I created another experiment to look at how do voters know whom to believe. So I simply filmed a news interview with a politician and journalist in which the journalist accuses the politician of dodging, and then the politician defends himself from the allegation. So the manipulation, I created different versions of the interview. 25% of the participants saw it be a truthful allegation and the politician refute it, 25% being a bogus allegation and the politician refute it, and then the other two versions being a true or bogus allegation with the politician not refuting it, not defending himself. And the results showed that perceptions of voters depend on a few things. First, it depends on whether voters project a motive for deception from journalists, meaning some voters think, well, journalists don't always tell the truth. Sometimes journalists are misleading in their coverage. Sometimes journalists have a motive or a reason to be deceptive in their coverage. And voters who did project that kind of motive for deception from journalists were impacted by the politician defending himself. But voters who don't project that motive for deception from journalists, they weren't as affected by the politician defending himself. Second thing the effects depend on is voters who perceive very low or high deceptive behavior from the politician. So if they think the politician is being deceptive in his behavior, and along those lines, third thing it depends on is voters' perception of the politician's demeanor. So these are outward, rather superficial, misleading cues that impact voters' perceptions of whether a politician is being deceptive and whether his defense against the challenge by the journalist is valid or not. And politicians' demeanor, this means things like if you're nervous, if you're fidgety, if you're making eye contact, if you're stammering, these kinds of largely non-verbal behavioral impressions. And they have this extreme effect on people's perceptions of a news interview. And the effects do not depend on whether or not the politician refutes a bogus allegation of evasion. So we see all these other variables that impact people's perceptions of a news interview and the effects of whether a journalist is truthfully or falsely accusing the politician of evasion, and that the effects don't depend on whether or not the politician refutes it. So that brings us then to question number 8, which returns us to the partisan dynamics of news interviews. And the question here is, when a TV partisan interviewer accuses a politician of dodging, how do voters know whom to believe? So we know from my previous studies that partisan cues play a big role. We know that also whether or not the journalist accuses the politician outright of being evasive has a really strong effect. And so in this wild and crazy world of political media, in which a lot of media have a partisan slant in their coverage, and their viewers are primarily of a particular ideology, what kind of effect does that have? So for this experiment, I took real news clips off of YouTube from real political interviews that had been on either CNN, which leans liberal for Democrats primarily, or on Fox News, which leans right for Republicans primarily, and edited those such that in one version, the interviewer was accusing the politician of dodging the question, and then in the other version, it was edited such that the politician was allowed to just answer and wasn't being accused. And these clips were cross-partisan, in which CNN was interviewing a Republican and Fox News was interviewing a Democrat. So I wanted to see the effects of that kind of cross-partisan cable news exposure, and whether it matters if the journalist, the interviewer, is being accusatory and combative and aggressive or not. And the results showed it depends on one thing, and one thing alone, really: voters' own partisan bias, their in-group, out-group partisan bias. So they like, or their attitudes, their liking, their favorability and all toward the politician depended on whether the politician shared their same party affiliation or was from their outgroup, their opposing party. So if you were a Republican viewer watching Fox News interview a Democrat, you didn't like the Democrat, and vice versa. If you were a Democratic voter watching CNN interview a Republican. And from the results, it showed it does not depend on whether the media accused the politician of deception, whether the interviewer was relatively civil or relatively aggressive and combative and accusing the politician of deception. Didn't matter. So it shows just how strong these partisan dynamics are, even in this hotly contested world of partisan media. And that brings us to our big overriding final 9th question: how do voters decide whether a politician is being deceptively evasive? We've seen all the different dynamics of different variables and their interactions and all the different experiments. And I recently ran this experiment where I showed everyone a political news interview, and I manipulated the party affiliation of the politician. So half of the voters who saw the interview thought he was a Republican, half thought he was a Democrat. I manipulated whether or not he was evasive. And then I employed different kinds of measurement to find out what people thought. First thing I did was simply ask people to type out, fill in the blank, what did you think of the interview? I didn't give any kind of prompt, no kind of priming. I simply employed what's called thought listing tasks, where I just asked them, what did you think of the interview? What did you think of the politician? And those thought listing tasks revealed most voters did not mention deception. It didn't come to mind for most voters who were exposed to the campaign interview. Even when they saw their opposing party being interviewed, and even when the opposing party was being deceptive, and even when they were asked about the candidate's demeanor. So returning to a phenomenon I mentioned earlier of defaulting to the truth and our truth bias and believing what we're told, we saw that to a very meaningful degree, that when people were simply asked, what did you think of the interview? And they were actually exposed to deception and exposed to an opposing party politician, they didn't mention it when they weren't primed or prompted to voluntarily talk about. However, when they filled out closed-ended scales, meaning measuring how deceptive did you think the politician was? How suspicious were you of the politician? How many questions did you think the politician dodged? Those kinds of closed-ended scales. Voters then reported that the politician was untrustworthy, that they were suspicious of the politician, and that they perceived all this deceptive messaging from the politician. So depending on how voters were actually asked, drove the extent to which voters reported thinking that the politician was really deceptive or not, by whether they were asked closed-ended scales or just open-ended thought listing tasks. All right, so those are the 9 questions that I've posed and asked and answered. So it brings us back to our original journey here, how politicians dodge questions and how they get caught. All right, so with 9 of those, I just told you those, which brings us now to those strategies. So we'll start with strategies for political campaigns. So what are the takeaways? What are the implications here? Strategies for political campaigns. First, and I'm not casting moral judgment, I'm not taking an ethical stance purely from a strategic standpoint. I'm giving these takeaways, these strategies for political campaigns. First, if you want to effectively dodge questions, here's how you as a politician, as a campaign strategist, can effectively dodge questions. Start an answer by appearing to address the topic of the question, but then smoothly change the subject. That was in that quotation attributed to campaign strategist David Axelrod by Barack Obama. And sure enough, the data bear that out. Second way to effectively dodge questions, don't overtly deflect. Be more cunning, more surreptitious in it. Don't say, I'm not going to answer that, because obviously voters will know you're dodging if you say that. Instead, talk around the periphery of the topic when you're asked a no-win question. Don't say that's a divisive question, I can't answer that, I'm going to decline to comment, no comment. Don't say that, just talk around the periphery of the topic when asked a no-win question, because the viewers, the voters, aren't going to be able to notice the difference probably anyway. Another strategy for political campaigns based on the experiments and studies that I ran, you should accuse your opponent of deception. As we saw from the presidential debate transcripts and the subsequent research on the effects of evasion by politicians, if you accuse your opponent of deception, you will be believed even if your opponent was actually honest. You're exploiting your supporters' truth default. Your supporters are defaulting to the truth. They're believing what they're exposed to, and you're exploiting that. And then you should also enact honest demeanor. Remember, we had that experiment where we saw that one of the driving factors of whether a politician could be successful relative to a journalist and refuting a bogus allegation of evasion, that a lot of it depended on the honest demeanor or dishonest demeanor. So focus on your demeanor. Your believability as a politician is largely based on demeanor cues. And then as far as web comments, we had that experiment with the web comments. As a political campaign, you have to be very attentive to web comments. You have to monitor web comments. If comments online materialize that are accusing you of stuff, your favorability will be jeopardized. People are going to believe the web comments, and even if there aren't web comments. When appearing on partisan interviews, a politician, based on my research, should only think of how your appearance will bolster your support among your party's voters. Based on my data, you're not going to win converts from the opposing party. You're not going to convert voters of the other party to come to your side. And based on my experiments, it doesn't matter if the outgroup interviewer is agreeable or hostile. If say you're a Republican appearing on CNN or a Democrat appearing on Fox News, doesn't matter how friendly or how aggressive the interviewer is towards you, your simple R or D party label, Republican or Democrat, will drive voters' perceptions of whether they like you or not. Okay, so then strategies for journalists. Many of you are studying journalism. What are strategies for journalists? All right, a takeaway from my experimentation showed that the mere act of asking voters if they think a politician is deceptive will make voters think the politician is deceptive. You, as a journalist interviewing a politician, covering a political campaign, you have a lot of power and influence, and I hope you wield it ethically and honestly, because simply asking voters if they think a politician is deceptive, thus priming or prompting voters to consider and be suspicious and skeptical, they're going to think the politician was deceptive simply by you asking, not even casting judgment. Another takeaway, I know a lot of journalists hate comment sections online, under their news reports, under their interviews online, they hate comments. Strategy for journalists: don't fret, don't worry about critical comments online. Attitudes toward you are going to remain high, even when you're accused of bad interviewing. So even when the web comments are attacking your interview style and defending the politician, attitudes toward you as the interviewer are still going to remain pretty high, regardless. And then when you as a journalist go so far as to accuse a politician of deception by findings revealed, that voters will believe you, even if your allegation is false, and regardless of whether the politician refutes you. So those are the strategies for journalists. And finally, all right, what are the strategies for voters? First of all, recognize that we all have a truth default. We all have a truth bias, meaning we tend to automatically believe politicians. The truth default still applies to politicians, and even when those politicians are from the opposing party. Whether you think a politician is deceptive, this is another implication for voters. Whether or not you think a politician is deceptive is based largely on whether you were asked or prompted to consider deception because of your truth default, because you're in that truth biased psychological processing of campaign messages. So you need to be vigilant. You need to pay attention. Don't fall prey to deception. Recognize that unless you're explicitly prompted or primed to think about it, you're probably not going to pay attention to whether the politician was deceptive or not. Partisan voters especially can be victimized by their own party's politician and can inaccurately assume that their opposing party is deceptive. So conversely, we see voters of one party can fall prey to deception if their own party's politician is being deceptive, or they can falsely think the other party is being deceptive even when they're not, because of that partisan bias. Now, for independent voters, let's say you don't identify strongly with any of the major political parties, you're more of a moderate and independent voter, beware of your susceptibility to identification. Remember, we looked at the impact of identification in mass communication. If you identify with a politician, you're going to get swept up in their perspective and not catch them being deceptive. Now, as far as being online, if you're a voter and you're watching a news interview online, you're watching political news on the web in which there are comments below, don't get manipulated by anonymous strangers' comments. Be aware that those are really powerful, they're really influential, but don't fall prey to them. And finally, don't get misled by impressions of a politician's demeanor. We saw from the results for that study experiment where one of the drivers of voters' perceptions of a politician being deceptive or not was based on the demeanor of the politician. And demeanor is largely unhelpful and misleading. Whether a politician is maintaining eye contact and looking nervous or fidgeting doesn't necessarily mean they're being deceptive. So pay attention to the actual words of what the politician is saying, and not so much their outward behavioral impressions of their nonverbal demeanor. All right, so that does it for my presentation, and it's been an honor getting to share my research with you all, and I look forward to whatever questions you might have for me.
Okay, here's an interesting question. We already have a very evasive politician in Mexico, our current president, who dodges questions every morning, giving deceiving answers. And although many people knew that he was evasive, they still voted for him. What good does it do to know a politician is evasive? Or how can we, common citizens, make a difference in our politics?
All right, so a couple things are being raised here with this question. One is the point that said, although many people knew that he was evasive, still voted for him. I did an experiment where I looked at differences in a politician being deceptive versus behaving deceptively. And there are some actual differences there. Some people are fine with a politician who on occasion behaves deceptively while thinking it's not a deceptive person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so the question, what good does it do to know that a politician is evasive? How do we as common citizens make a difference in our politics? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is I would post web comments underneath the interviews. I don't know if the interviews that are being referenced in the question are posted online on a daily basis or not, or if the comment section has been deactivated, but we see that comments are very powerful. And we see that the power of priming or prompting people to be suspicious and skeptical and notice that it's happening is also really effective. That maybe people aren't, and I'm not casting judgment on the politician in question here. I'm not personally familiar with these allegations of evasion that are being lodged here in this question. I personally can't speak to the extent to which the politician is being evasive or answering, but simply based off of my research, whether or not he's being evasive, any politician in question, whether in Mexico or anywhere else, simply by alerting people to this will deactivate their truth default, and they will be more suspicious, and they will perceive more deceptive communication and distrust the politician. So that's
Okay.
Hopefully that's helpful.
All right, and that leads to another question. Globally, the image of politicians is not very good, or it is biased by partisan issues. Do you think these results could be the same in other countries?
I guess that would be up to my amazing audience here as to whether you think that these kinds of results would generalize. Of course, all these studies were run with voters in the US. However, whether you're in the US or Mexico or any other country, we all have brains. We all process information generally the same kind of way. We all have similar kinds of attention spans and partisan biases. And the truth default has replicated across different continents. So we know that whether you're in North or South America or Asia, that you have a truth default and you exhibit the same kind of in-group, out-group bias in your processing of messages. So I think that the processing here that I've explored certainly would generalize and isn't so dependent on cultural contexts.
Oh, okay. That was the next question exactly. Is it dependent on cultural context? In your own studies, did you take a look at, for example, level of education or ethnic background of your participants? Did that make a difference?
It did not make a difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
typically I'll ask different demographic questions, level of education, age. I think the only time there was a difference in those various experiments that I shared with all of you was in the web comments. I think that when I asked people to type their own comments, if you could type your own comments beneath the news interview, what would you type? Younger voters, younger like college students, were not as susceptible to typing comments in line with whatever they were exposed to, whereas older voters were more susceptible. Older voters did type comments more in line with whatever they were exposed to. So maybe the effects, at least online, are stronger for older demographic.
All right. Here's another question. It says, we clearly see this continually in the media. I think she's talking about evasiveness. Besides maintaining a good reputation, what else do you think is just as important for politicians?
Well, I mean, from a really cynical standpoint, all that politicians care about is getting 50% plus one, or whatever plurality of the vote, whatever they need to get. So getting votes, getting donations, you know, making your base happy. But I looked at a lot of different outcome variables in my research. Perceptions of being deceptive, detecting deception, detecting dodging, trustworthiness, suspicion, evasiveness, and these all play a role. And there's just so many different variables, and we could ask 100 different voters what was the most important thing to you about that politician in the interview and get practically 100 different answers. But generally, the credibility of the politician is of the utmost, because presumably everything else will fall into line or out of line after credibility.
Okay. All right. In your own studies, have you found that politicians from one party are more trustworthy than another, or is it the same?
In the content analyses that I did of presidents and the extent to which they dodged or answered questions in press conferences and in debates, there was not a difference between the two parties. There were individual differences. Some presidents and presidential candidates were far more evasive than others, but there was not a statistically significant difference between Democrats and Republicans overall.
Okay. Another question here. Lately, we've been seeing that there seems to be like a battle between journalists on one side and politicians on the other. Is this a recent phenomenon, or has this been happening for a long time? Has this always happened?
It's in as far as our relatively recent modern history. I mean, I don't know what it was like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever. But it's worse now than it was a few years ago. And a few years ago, it was worse than it was a few years before that. It has been growing. And politicians and journalists are more, as far as our recent modern history, politicians and journalists are more adversarial and combative than before. And it's been growing. And yeah, journalists are not afraid to insert themselves into interviews. And this doesn't just go for politics. I mean, interviewing actors, you'll see television, interviews on television about a new movie coming out. Sometimes the interview will devolve into getting kind of combative between the interviewer and the actor. And you'll see actors act the same kind of way as an aggressive politician and not liking their veracity being impugned by a journalist. And journalists have gotten more adversarial also through the years. And we could look at any number of reasons for that. I mean, it's a highly competitive marketplace of media. You have to get attention, you have to get eyeballs. There's so many different channels and websites out there. Very competitive marketplace. So a lot of it is to get attention.
Okay. Okay, here's another question. How much is the perception of voters affected when identifying dodging questions? Since in Mexico, there are many more parties, so the voters are not so identified with one party, unlike the US where there are only two. So for example, you notice that you mentioned that people tend to be partisan, right? One party or the other. But in Mexico, we have many more options to select. Would this make a difference?
I have no idea. That's a really good question. And I've never run a study where I had more than two parties. I've run a bunch of studies where the politician had no party affiliation to simply look at the effects, not getting muddied by partisan labels. And the studies I've done with partisanship was just two parties. I guess the question would be, and the person who poses the question kind of implies that maybe with multiple parties, people aren't as strongly engrossed in just one perspective of one party, which could mean that maybe there's less partisan bias. But I don't know. That's a great question.
We'll have to do our own studies, I guess. All right. Okay, don't have anything more. Does anybody else? ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? Okay, we'll give them 2 seconds. Doesn't look like there's anything else. Okay, thank you.
Those are great questions. Great questions.
Yes. All right, well, thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Shocking, I think, to see how much power web comments have.
Well, good. Well, thank you. It's been an honor to get to share my research with you all.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Clemenson. I think questions were very interesting because people were very interested in your talk. So it's been an honor to have you with us. I hope it's the first of many times in the future. So either in campus or online or whatever, we hope to see you very soon again. I agree that your research is very interesting. I agree with maybe we could do something like that in our school. So thank you very much again. We hope to see you very soon. And thank you, Nilsa, Dixie, and Jaime, Erendira, and all of you that were connected with us. Muchas gracias a todos los que nos acompañaron. Fue un gusto. Y thank you, Dr. Clemenson.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.